This story differs from our usual format. What follows is a direct testimony, a first-person account from someone who witnessed these events firsthand during 37 years of captivity in the American South between 1809 and 1846. My name is Samuel Pritchard, and for 37 years, I belonged to another man. I've kept silent about what I witnessed on that Virginia plantation for longer than I care to remember. But before I leave this world, the truth must be told. What happened there wasn't just the familiar cruelty of bondage. It was something that twisted the very nature of human suffering into shapes I still cannot fully comprehend. The official records say Riverside Plantation operated from 1809 until it burned in 1846. What those records don't say is why 17 slaves disappeared from the property books in a single month, or why the Hero family buried 3 generations in unmarked graves on the eastern ridge. I was there. I saw what they did and I saw what it cost them. Before we continue with my testimony, I need you to understand something. There are witnesses to history, and then there are those forced to participate in its darkest experiments. I was both. If you're listening to this account, I ask that you leave a comment telling me where you're from, north or south, city or country. This story belongs to all of us, whether we want to claim it or not, and if you believe the past should be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel. The dead deserve their testimony. What I'm about to share began long before I understood what I was seeing. It began with compromise made between desperate men in ire when cotton prices fell and pride became more valuable than gold. I was born in 1809, the same year Thomas Hargrove purchased 200 acres off bottomland along the James River, 20 miles south of Richmond. My mother belonged to the previous owner, and when the property changed hands, so did we. 15 souls in total, though that number would grow and shrink in ways that still haunt me sleep. Riverside wasn't the largest plantation in Chesterfield County, but Thomas Hargrove had ambitions that exceeded his means. He was a tall man with narrow shoulders and eyes that never quite met yours when he spoke. His wife, Catherine, was the daughter of a Richmond merchant who'd made his fortune in tobacco before the soil gave out. She brought money to the marriage, but not enough to satisfy Thomas's vision of himself as a Virginia gentleman. The main house stood on a rise overlooking the river. A 2-story structure with white columns that were always slightly off-center, as if the building itself knew it was pretending to be something it wasn't. Behind it stretched the quarters where we lived. 12 cabins arranged in 2 rows, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 of us, depending on the season and Thomas' financial fortunes. I was 7 years old when I first understood that something at Riverside was different from the other plantations I'd heard about from the field hands who were occasionally hired from neighboring properties. It wasn't the work. We all knew about work. About the ache in your bones that never quite left. About hands that bled and backs that screamed. It was the watching. Thomas Hargrove watched us with an intensity that went beyond the usual overseer scrutiny. He kept a leather journal that he carried everywhere, making marks in it with a pencil he'd sharpen against a small whetstone. Years later, I learned he was recording us. Not our work output, though that was part of it, but something else. Our habits, our relationships, our breaking points. My mother worked in the big house as a cook. My father, though Thomas never recognized such bonds, was a man named Jacob, who worked the tobacco fields. He had 2 sisters, Ruth, who was 9, and Mary, barely 3 years old. We lived in the cabin closest to the main house, which meant my mother could be summoned at any hour and often was. The other slaves at Riverside came from different places. There was old Daniel, who claimed to remember Africa, though none quite believed him. There was Esther and her husband Benjamin, who'd been sold together from a plantation in North Carolina. There were the field hands, Moses, Isaac, Elijah, and young Thomas, called Little Thomas, to distinguish him from our owner. There was Sarah, who helped me mother in the kitchen, and her daughter Grace, who was close to Ruth's. And there was Augustus. Augustus was a mystery even to us. He'd arrived at Riverside 3 years before I was born, purchased at auction in Richmond for a sum that made the other plantation owners laugh at Thomas's foolishness. Augustus could read and write, a dangerous thing in a slave, as we all knew. He'd been educated by his previous owner's children, taught alongside them until the family fell into debt and had to sell their property piece by piece. Augustus was the last to go. Thomas Hargrove bought him specifically for his learning. He made Augustus a house servant, had him manage the plantation's records, keep track of supplies, and even teach young Richard Hargrove, Thomas's only son, his letters and numbers. The other slaves didn't quite know what to make of Augustus. He lived in a small room off the kitchen, ate better food than the rest of us, and wore clothes that had been tailored rather than roughly sewn. But he was still a slave. And that fundamental truth bound him to us in ways that transcended his privileges. The year I turned 7, 1816, was when the watching intensified. Thomas had made a poor investment in a cotton gin that never worked properly, and his creditors were circling. I didn't understand the economics then, but I understood the tension in the air, the way Catherine's voice grew sharper when she spoke to the house servants, the way Thomas's journal entries became longer and more frequent. It was also the year that Elijah disappeared. Elijah was a field hand, perhaps 20 years old, with a strong back and a quiet disposition that kept him out of trouble. He'd been born on a plantation in South Carolina, and sold north when his owner died. He rarely spoke about his past, but once I heard him tell Moses that he'd had a wife down south, sold away when she was pregnant with their first child. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Elijah wasn't at morning muster. This was unusual. The punishment for being late was severe enough that even the sick would drag themselves to the yard behind the main house where Thomas counted us each dawn. My mother told me later that Thomas' face had gone pale when Elijah didn't appear, and he'd sent 2 of the field hands to check the man's cabin. Elijah was gone. His few possessions remained. A spare shirt, a carving of a bird he'd been working on, the thin blanket we all slept under. But Elijah himself had vanished. Thomas ordered a search. We looked in the tobacco barns, the storage sheds, the smokehouse. We walked the boundaries of the property, checking the woods that bordered the southern edge. We searched for 2 full days while the tobacco that needed harvesting sat in the fields, and Thomas's face grew darker with each passing hour. They never found Elijah. Not then. What they did find 3 days after his disappearance was his shirt floating in the river about a mile downstream. It was torn, stained with something dark that might have been blood or might have been river mud. Thomas held it up during evening muster, his face unreadable. Elijah tried to run. He announced the river took him. Let this be a lesson about the price of freedom attempted too rashly, but I was standing close enough to see Thomas's hands shaking as he held that shirt. I was close enough to see him glance toward the eastern ridge, where the ground rose toward the Trean, and the old family cemetery sat behind its wrought iron fence. My mother wouldn't speak of it, but that night I heard her praying in a way I'd never heard before, not asking for deliverance or mercy, but asking for protection from something she would name. 2 weeks later, little Thomas, the field hand not the owner's son, complained of pains in his stomach. By evening, he was dead. The doctor Thomas Hargrove summoned from Richmond called it bowel inflammation and charged Thomas $5 for the visit. We buried little Thomas in the slave cemetery beyond the quarters, and Thomas made annotation in his journal, his pencil moving quickly across the page. That's when I first noticed the pattern. Though I was too young to understand what I was seeing. Every time someone died or disappeared, Thomas would spend hours in his study, poring over his journals by lamplight. Augustus would be called in, and they would talk in low voices behind the closed door. If you're wondering what could drive a man to such careful documentation of human suffering, hit that like button and leave your thoughts in the comments. What I'm about to tell you next shows how a ledger of souls can become an instruction manual for something far darker than simple bondage. The years that followed Elijah's disappearance settled into a rhythm of watching and being watched. It grew from a child into a young man, and with that growth came a deeper understanding of the machinery of Riverside Plantation. By the time I was 14, I'd been assigned to work alongside Augustus, learning Toriad and write despite the laws forbidding it. Thomas needed someone who could assist with his increasingly complex record-keeping, and my mother had bargained her own increased hours in the kitchen for my education. Those hours in Thomas's study, copying figures and letters under Augustus's patient instruction, gave me access to something most slaves never saw. The mind of their owner laid bare on paper. Thomas' journals weren't simply plantation records. They were experiments in human durability. He recorded how long a person could work in August heat before collapsing. He documented which family separations caused the most visible grief and which seemed to be endured with resignation. He noted which punishments produced immediate compliance and which bred long-term resentment. He tracked everything. Birth rates, death rates, attempted escapes, and what he called optimal ratios of hope to despair. Augustus never spoke directly about what we were reading. But sometimes his hand would pause over a page, and I'd see something flicker across his face. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow, but something that contained elements of both. He thinks we read mathematics, Augustus told me once, his voice barely a whisper. He thinks if he can just find the right equation, he can make us profitable and keep us from running. He doesn't understand that we're not numbers. Weary testimonies waiting to be given. In 1823, when I was 14, Thomas Hargrove made a trip to Richmond and returned with a man named Dr. Silas Winthrop. Winthrop was thin and severe with wire-rimmed spectacles and a black medical bag that never left his side. He stayed at Riverside for 3 weeks, examining each slave with an attention that went far beyond checking for obvious illness. He measured our skulls with calipers. He tested our reflexes and our pain responses. He asked questions about our parentage, our health histories, our dreams and fears. And Thomas stood beside him the entire time, making notes. Always making notes that they're trying to prove something, Augustus told me one evening as we filed papers in the study. Thomas and Winthrop were at dinner and we had a rare moment of privacy. There's a debate happening in the medical societies whether we're fully human or some intermediate species. Winthrop is gathering evidence that I was young enough that the full implications hadn't settled into my bones yet. Evidence of what? That we don't feel pain the same way they do, that we're built for labor the way horses are built for pulling plows. That ownership isn't just legal, it's natural. Augustus showed me a letter in Thomas's desk, one Winthrop had written after his visit. In it, the doctor praised Thomas's meticulous documentation of Negro physiology and temperament, and encouraged him to continue his observations, particularly around what they called stress thresholds and recovery patterns. That letter was dated May 15, 1823. 3 months later, my sister Ruth disappeared. Ruth was 16 with my mother's quick smile and my father Jacob's steady hands. She worked in the fields during planting and harvest and helped in the big house during slower seasons. She sang while she worked hymns mostly, though sometimes she'd make up her own words to melodies she'd heard from the hired hands who came from other plantations. She vanished on a Sunday, our one partial day of rest. My mother had last seen her after midday meal, walking toward the river with a basket to gather blackberries. When sunset came and Ruth hadn't returned, my mother's composure, the careful mask she'd worn for 17 years of bondage, finally cracked. Thomas organized a search, but it felt perfunctory, as if he already knew it would yield nothing. They found Ruth's basket overturned on the riverbank, blackberries scattered across the mud. They found footprints leading toward the water and then nothing. The river, Thomas said again, using the same words he'd used for Elijah 7 years earlier. It's treacherous this time of year. The current is stronger than it looks. But Ruth could swim. We'd all learned in that river, knew its moods and its dangers, and had seen her footprints in that mud. She'd been standing still, not running toward the water. The prints around hers told a different story. Larger prints, boots, not bare feet, multiple sets converging in where she'd been standing. My mother aged a decade in the week that followed. She stopped singing in the kitchen. She stopped speaking except when directly addressed. And at night, I'd wake to hear her crying with a sound like something was being torn out of her chest. My father, Jacob, tried to investigate on his own. He asked questions of the other field hands, searched the property during whatever spare moments he could find. 2 weeks after Ruth disappeared, Jacob was sold to a plantation in Georgia. Thomas informed us at morning muster, his face impassive, that Jacob had been troublesome and needed to be removed for the stability of Riverside's workforce, that I never saw my father again. This is what they don't write in the histories, how resistance was punished through erasure. How the act of asking questions could result in permanent separation from everyone you loved. But I'm writing it now in my own way, speaking it into whatever future might listen. Thomas' journals from that period became even more detailed. He recorded my mother's grief in clinical terms. Subject displays diminished work capacity following family disruption. Recovery timeline estimated 4 to 6 weeks. Note, emotional attachment to offspring creates operational vulnerability. Augustus let me read those entries. I think he wanted me to understand the full scope of what we were living within. Not just slavery, but slavery observed and documented as if we were specimens in some grand natural history of human suffering. They're building ancients of us. Augustus said, every observation, every measurement, every notation about how we respond to loss, they're creating a manual for how to own human beings more efficiently. The year I turned 17, Catherine Harrow fell ill. The Richmond doctors couldn't diagnose her ailment. She simply grew weaker, unable to keep food down, her skin taking on a yellowish cast. Thomas spent a fortune on treatments, patent medicines, special diets, even bringing in a physician from Baltimore who specialized in women's disorders. Nothing helped. She died in the spring of 1826 on a morning when apple blossoms were falling like snow across the property. Thomas shut himself in his study for 3 days. When he emerged, he looked like a man who'd made a terrible calculation and decided to proceed with it anyway. Young Richard, who was then 18, took over some of his father's studies. He was a softer version of Thomas, not kind exactly, but less obsessed with documentation, more interested in the mechanical aspects of plantation management. He treated us as property to be maintained rather than mysteries to be solved. For a brief period, life at Riverside became almost ordinary. The watching diminished. The journals sat closed on Thomas's desk. We worked. We endured, and the seasons turned in their reliable pattern, but by then I'd learned that calm at Riverside was always temporary, just the pause between one experiment and the next. The calm lasted almost 2 years. During that time, I continued working with Augustus, managing the plantation's records and learning everything I could from the books in Thomas's library. He never explicitly gave me permission to read them, but he never explicitly forbade it either. And Augustus took that ambiguity as license to educate me. I read about agriculture and animal husbandry, about the history of Virginia and the principles of what they called scientific plantation management. I read Thomas Jefferson's writing on slavery, his elaborate justifications twisted into philosophical knots. I read treatises on human varieties and racial characteristics, all written by men who'd never spent a day in bondage, but felt qualified to explain our nature-toth world. And I read Thomas's journals, every volume I could access. What I discovered was that Riverside wasn't just a plantation. It was a laboratory. Thomas had been corresponding with other plantation owners, sharing his observations and receiving theirs in return. There was a network of them scattered across Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Men who saw themselves as pioneers in what they called rational slavery. They believed that by applying scientific principles to human ownership, they could solve the economic inefficiencies that plagued the institution. The letters were full of questions. What ratio of punishment to reward produced optimal work output? How much food was truly necessary to maintain health versus how much was wasted on comfort? What family structures, if any, should be preserved or encouraged? How could the inherent human desire for freedom be systematically crushed or redirected? They discussed these questions the way naturalists discuss bird migrations or crop rotations, with clinical detachment, as if the subjects under examination weren't human beings who felt pain and love and hope. One letter in particular from a planter named Harrison in South Carolina described what he called strategic disappearances that he discovered that the occasional unexplained absence from the slave population created a useful level of fear, not panic, which was counterproductive, but a steady background anxiety that discouraged organized resistance or escape attempts. Let them wonder, Harrison wrote. Let them create their own explanations. The uncertainty is more effective than any punishment. Thomas had underlined that passage 3 times. In 1828, when I was 19, Augustus called me into the study late one evening. Thomas and Richard were in Richmond settling some business with Thomas's creditors. We had the house to ourselves. "You need to know where she is," Augustus said without preamble. I knew immediately he meant Ruth. "Tell me." Augustus took a key from his pocket, a key I'd never seen before, and led me from the main house toward the eastern ridge. We walked in darkness, the moon hidden behind clouds, until we reached the family cemetery, where generations of harrows lay behind that wrought iron fence. But we didn't stop at the fence. Augustus led me past Itinto the woods beyond to a small clearing I'd never noticed before. In the center of the clearing was a depression in the ground, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, marked at one end by a plain river stone. "There are 14 of them," Augustus said quietly. 14 stones, 14 people who didn't die of disease or accident, but were disappeared. When Thomas needed to demonstrate the cost of resistance or independence, or simply existing in a way that threatened his experiments, I felt my legs weaken. Ruth, the 6th stone from the north. She'd been asking questions about the journals, talking to some of the other field hands about what they recorded. Thomas couldn't risk her sharing what she knew. "You've known this whole time." My voice came out strangled. "Why didn't you tell someone?" Augustus turned to me, and in the darkness, I could barely make out his expression. "Tell who?" "The county sheriff who dined at Thomas's table? The Richmond authorities who depend on plantation owners for their tax base? The other slaves who have no legal standing to testify against a white man? I've been documenting it, Samuel. Everything, every disappearance, every death, every experiment. I'm creating a counterledger to his journals. Testimony for some future court that might actually listen." He pulled a wrapped bundle from inside his coat, papers covered in his careful handwriting. "But I needed someone younger to carry this forward. That I'm 48 years old, Samuel. I've already lived longer than most of us do. You're going to outlive this place. And when you do, you're going to tell this story, ooh." Just when I thought I understood the full scope of the horror at Riverside, Augustus's revelations opened a new depth of darkness. If this testimony is affecting you, share it with someone who needs to understand what history contains. Hit that like button if you believe these stories deserve to be told, and subscribe to make sure you hear how this account concludes. Now, let me tell you what happened when Thomas returned from Richmond and discovered that Augustus had shown me the clearing. Thomas knew that I never discovered how, whether he'd set some trap we'd sprung, or whether one of the house servants had seen us and reported back. But 3 days after Augustus showed me the graves, Thomas called us both into his study. He sat behind his desk, Richard standing beside him, and between them on the polished wood surface lay Augustus' hidden papers, the counter-ledger, every careful notation, every documented death, every piece of evidence against Thomas Harrof's experiments in human suffering. "Augustus," Thomas said, his voice perfectly calm. "You've been keeping unauthorized records." Augustus stood perfectly still beside me. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that literacy in a slave is illegal in Virginia? That maintaining such records constitutes incitement to rebellion?" "Yes, sir." Thomas picked up one of the pages, studied it with apparent interest. "Remarkably detailed work. You've documented every death on this property for the past 20 years. You've included the circumstances, your observations about cause, even speculation about intent." He set the page down carefully. "You've essentially written a criminal indictment of me. I've written the truth, sir." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. I stood frozen, waiting for violence, for rage, for whatever punishment Thomas deemed appropriate for such profound betrayal. Instead, Thomas smiled. "The truth," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose you have. And do you know what's remarkable, Augustus? It changes nothing. You could publish these papers in the Richmond Inquirer tomorrow and it will change nothing. You could testify before a judge, a jury, the governor himself, and your words would carry no legal weight whatsoever. You are property documenting the actions of your owner. Your testimony is inadmissible, your truth is voiceless. He gathered the papers together, tapped them into a neat stack, and then fed them one by one into the fireplace. We watched as 20 years of careful documentation burned to ash. However, Thomas continued, the fact that you attempted this does create a problem. Not a legal problem, a practical one. You've demonstrated that you think of yourself as more than you are. That you imagine yourself as some kind of witness rather than what you actually are, my property, serving my purposes. He turned to me. Samuel, you've been learning from Augustus. Have you been helping him with this project? Every instinct screamed at me to lie, to claim ignorance, but I'd watched Augustus stand firm in his truth, and something in me refused to betray that courage. No, sir, I said, but I knew about it. Thomas nodded slowly. Honesty, that's interesting. He made a note in his journal, even now, always documenting. You're 20 years old, Samuel. You have potential value. You read and write better than Richard here. Frankly, you could be useful for many years yet, but I need to know that you understand your position. He stood up, walked to where Augustus and I were standing. Your sister understood something important at the end. She understood that resistance has consequences. Your father understood it too, though it took selling him away taught each that lesson. The question is, do we need to teach you the same way or have you learned from their examples? I had 1 second to make a choice that would define the rest of my life. Stand with Augustus in open resistance and be disappeared like Ruth, or bow my head and survive to carry the testimony forward as Augustus had intended. I bowed my head. I understand my position, sir. Good. Thomas returned to his desk. Then here's what's going to happen. Augustus, you're going to be sold. I've already arranged it with a trader in Richmond that he specializes in difficult cases, slaves who need to be moved far enough away that their influence can't spread. Georgia, probably, maybe Alabama, somewhere you can start fresh without the burden of all these ideas about truth and testimony. Augustus's face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench briefly at his sides. Samuel, Thomas continued, you're going to take over all of Augustus' duties. You'll manage the records, handle the correspondence, help Richard with plantation administration, and you're going to do it knowing that any repetition of Augustus' behavior will result not in your own punishment, but in the sale of your mother and your youngest sister, Mary. Do we understand each other? Yes, sir. Excellent, Richard, take Augustus to the quarters and make sure he's secured until the trader arrives tomorrow. As Richard led Augustus away, the older man caught my eye for just a moment. He didn't look angry or betrayed. He looked like a man who'd completed his life's work and was ready to face whatever came next. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the ceiling and thinking about that clearing in the woods. 14 stones, 14 people whose truths had been buried. And now Augustus would be gone, sold away before he could tell anyone else what heck knew. But Thomas had made a miscalculation. He thought he'd won by burning the papers and removing Augustus. What he didn't realize was that I'd spent 2 years reading those papers, memorizing them, internalizing every detail of his experiments and their consequences. The ledger wasn't gone. It was just transferred to a different kind of storage, one that couldn't be burned or sold away. The trader came at dawn. His name was Croc, a thick-shouldered man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco and hands that looked comfortable with violence. That he shackled Augustus and loaded him into a wagon along with 2 other slaves he'd purchased from a neighboring plantation. As the wagon pulled away, Augustus looked back at Riverside one final time, our eyes met across the distance, and I saw him nod once. A gesture that said everything he couldn't speak aloud. Remember, document, testify. I never saw Augustus again. But 31 years later, when I finally gained my freedom, the first thing I did was try to find out what happened to him. I traced him through bills of sale and plantation records, through the whispered networks of people who tracked lost family members. He'd been sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama where he lived another 8 years before dying of what the records called consumption. But before he died, he taught 6 other slaves to read and write. And one of them taught 6 more, and those silent testimonies passed hand to hand in darkness became part of the great ledger of crimes that would eventually be called to account. But hats later in the story. In 1828, I was 20 years old, and I had just agreed to serve the man who'd murdered my sister and driven my father away. The years following Augustus's departure were the longest of my captivity. I was trapped in a position of relative privilege, working in the main house, managing records, eating better food than the field hands, while knowing the full scope of what that privilege cost. Every number I entered in Thomas' ledgers represented human suffering quantified. Every letter I copied for his correspondence with other plantation owners spread his philosophy of systematic dehumanization that I became what Augustus had been, a witness with access but no voice, documentation without the power to accuse. The difference was that I now understood the full architecture of what Thomas had built. This wasn't just a plantation. It was a prototype, a model that other owners were studying and attempting to replicate across Virginia and the deeper South. Thomas's correspondence increased during this period. Letters arrived weekly from plantation owners in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, even as far as Mississippi. They asked detailed questions. How did Thomas maintain discipline without excessive physical punishment that might reduce work capacity? What ratio of family units Tozingle workers produced optimal stability? How could the natural human desire for literacy be suppressed without creating resentment that led to sabotage or flight? I read every letter. I memorized the names. Harrison in Charleston, Whitfield in Raleigh, Petton in Natchez. I noted their questions and Thomas's responses, creating a mental map of this network of men who believed they could perfect the machinery of human bondage through careful observation and documentation. By 1833, when I was 24, Thomas had begun hosting what he called agricultural symposiums at Riverside. These were gatherings of like-minded plantation owners who would spend 3 or 4 days discussing their methods, sharing their findings, and touring each other's properties to observe practices firsthand. I served at these gatherings, invisible in the way that servants were always invisible to their owners. I poured whiskey and cleared plates, while men discussed use as if we were cattle or horses, subjects for breeding programs, labor optimization studies, and what they euphemistically called motivation research. During one such gathering in the spring of 1834, a planter named Matthias Cutler from South Carolina presented what he called his graduated pressure system. He developed a methodology where small infractions received mild punishment, medium infractions received moderate punishment, and major infractions defined as anything that threatened the owner's authority or property received what he termed erasure responses. The key, Cutler explained to the assembled owners, is that erasure must appear natural. A slave who simply vanishes creates dangerous speculation. But a slave who attempts escape and drowns in a river, or who falls ill and dies suddenly, or who is sold away for behavioral issues. These create cautionary narratives that the other slaves will internalize and pass among themselves. Thomas nodded vigorously, making notes. This was his philosophy articulated by someone else, validated by their independent arrival at the same conclusions. The documentation is crucial, Cutler continued. Every eraser must be recorded with sufficient detail that you can reference it later, but vague enough that casual inspection reveals nothing incriminating. Dates, circumstances, witnesses, but always with plausible alternative explanations. I stood against the wall holding a pitcher of water, my face carefully blank, and thought about Ruth's basket overturned by the river, about Elijah Storn's shirt found downstream, about all the accidents and natural deaths that Thomas had recorded in his journals with exactly the kind of calculated ambiguity Cutler was describing. After dinner that evening, as I was clearing the study, I overheard Thomas and Cutler talking in lower voices. The real challenge, Cutler said, is maintaining the eraser sites. Family members will search, field hands will speculate. You need a location that's accessible to you, but psychologically off limits to them. I use the old cemetery, Thomas replied. Beyond the family plots, in the woods, the slaves won't go there. Too many superstitions about disturbing the dead, especially white dead. And it's far enough from the quarters that nighttime activity goes unnoticed. Cutler laughed. Elegant. Use a ravine on the southern boundary off me property. Steep sides, heavy vegetation. Tell them it's dangerous, that slaves have fallen and been injured, and they avoid it naturally. I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. These men were comparing notes on where to hide bodies the way other men might compare notes on where to store farm equipment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 14 stones in the clearing, about how Thomas had systematized even murder, turned it into a methodology that could be taught and shared, and I thought about all the other plantations, all the other clearings and ravines, and hidden places where testimony was being buried. The next morning, I made a decision that would shape the remaining years of my bondage. I would document everything, not in writing that could be discovered and destroyed, but in memory so detailed and organized that it could be reproduced years later if I survived to freedom. I started with the names and dates I already knew from Augustus' work. Then I added every piece of information I encountered. Attendees at Thomas's symposiums, details from letters, conversations overheard while serving meals. I organized it all into mental categories. People, places, methods, justifications, evidence. It became a kind of meditation, this mental cataloging. At night, I would lie awake reviewing what I'd learned, testing my recall, ensuring that nothing was forgotten. During the day, I would add new observations, cross-reference information, build connections between different pieces of the puzzle. I was creating testimony that existed only in my mind, but that was more complete and damning than any physical document could be. By 1835, Richard had married Margaret, and the character of Riverside began to shift. Margaret brought Charleston sophistication to the plantation, parties and social gatherings that had nothing to do with Thomas's experiments, but everything to do with maintaining their status among Virginia's planter class. These gatherings created new opportunities for observation. Wealthy guests would bring their own house servants, and in the kitchen and quarters we would exchange information that I learned about conditions on other plantations, about owners who were cruel or lenient, about places where slaves had successfully escaped and places where attempted flight meant certain death. One woman, a lady's maid named Celia from a Richmond household, told May about a network of free black people in the city who helped fugitive slaves reach the North. She didn't have details. That information was too dangerous to share casually. But she confirmed that paths to freedom existed for those brave or desperate enough to tempt them. I thought about running. I was young, educated, and had skills that could help me pass as free if I made it to Pennsylvania or New York. But I kept thinking about Augustus's words. You're going to outlive this place. And when you do, you're going to tell this story. Running meant saving myself. Staying meant preserving the testimony that could someday be used to demonstrate the full scope of what slavery had been. Not just the familiar cruelties that everyone knew about, but the calculated, systematic, scientifically justified humanization that men like Thomas Harrove had perfected. So I stayed, and I watched, and I remembered. In the summer of 1837, something happened that crystallized everything I'd been observing into sharp, terrible focus. A new field hand arrived at Riverside, purchased at auction in Richmond. His name was Isaiah, and he was perhaps 19 years old, strong and healthy, exactly the kind of worker Thomas preferred. But Isaiah had one characteristic that immediately caught Thomas's attention. He could read. His previous owner had been an elderly widow who'd allowed her house servants to become literate, ignoring Virginia's laws against slave education. When she died and her estate was liquidated, Isaiah was sold with this dangerous skill noted in the auction catalog. Thomas bought him specifically because he of this literacy, seeing an opportunity for what he called a degradation study. That he wanted to document how quickly an educated slave could be reduced to the mental state of an uneducated one through systematic deprivation and humiliation. I was ordered to teach Isaiah his duties in the tobacco fields, and during those first few days, we had brief opportunities to talk. He's going to try to break you, I warned Isaiah, not through physical punishment. That's too crude for him. He's going to try to make you forget that you can read, forget that you're anything more than what he says you are. Isaiah looked at me with eyes that still held hope. Let him try. I know who I am. No man can take that from me. I wanted to tell him about the clearing in the woods, about the 14 stones, about what happened to people who held on to themselves too fiercely at Riverside. But I didn't. Maybe I was a coward. Maybe I thought Hainaid that hoped to survive what was coming. Maybe I just couldn't bear to beta one who crushed it. Thomas began his experiment immediately. He gave Isaiah tasks that required no thinking. Digging holes and filling them in, moving rocks from one pile to another, and then back again. Work that was deliberately meaningless and exhausting that he timed how long it took before Isaiah began to show signs of what Thomas called mental deterioration, depression, confusion, loss of initiative. I had to record all of it in the journals. Isaiah's responses, his attempts to maintain dignity, the slow erosion of his spirit under the weight of calculated absurdity. Thomas observed him like a naturalist observing an animal in captivity, noting every change in behavior or expression. After 3 months, Isaiah tried to escape. He made it almost 15 miles before the dogs found him. They brought him back torn and bleeding, and Thomas had him whipped, not excessively, just enough to serve as an example to the other field hands. But the real punishment came afterward. Thomas informed Isaiah that he was being moved to the main house as a servant, ostensibly a reward for surviving his punishment. But I knew what Thomas was really doing. He was placing Isaiah where he could be observed more closely, where his continued existence would serve as a living demonstration of what happened to slaves who tried to escape their assigned roles. Isaiah became a ghost in his own skin. He performed his duties with mechanical precision, speaking only when spoken to, his eyes fixed on nothing. The young man who'd insisted that no one could take away his sense of self had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt as exactly what Thomas wanted, an obedient, thoughtless piece of property. One evening, as I was filing papers in the study, Thomas looked up from his journal and spoke tone directly. "Do you understand what you're seeing with Isaiah, Samuel?" I kept me voice neutral. "No, sir. I'm documenting the transformation of consciousness under controlled conditions." Isaiah arrived here with an inflated sense of his own capabilities. Literacy gave him the illusion of equality. I've stripped away that illusion and returned him to his natural state. It's not cruelty. It's correction. He gestured at his journals. All of this, everything I've done here for 30 years has been in service of demonstrating that slavery isn't a moral wrong. It's a social necessity. Your people aren't capable of self-governance. You need structure, guidance, control, and the evidence is right here, documented and reproducible, that I looked at this man who'd owned me for 28 years, who'd murdered my sister, who'd sold my father, who'd spent decades turning human suffering into data points for his philosophical justifications, and I saw finally not a monster, but something more pathetic. A man who needed so desperately to believe in his own righteousness they'd constructed an entire intellectual edifice to avoid facing the simple truth that what he did for profit he justified with science. "Yes, sir," I said, because that was the only safe response. "But it hot you can write all the justifications you want. You can document and measure and theorize, but testimony will outlast your theories. The truth will outlast your lies." That night, I added Isaiah's story to my mental catalog, another piece of evidence in the case I was building against Thomas Harrove and everyone like him. By 1840, Thomas's health had begun to decline. He was 61 years old, and decades of managing a plantation had worn him down. His hands shook when he wrote. And sometimes I'd find him in the study staring at his journals with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not regret exactly, but something close to bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite understand how he'd arrived at this point in his life. My mother died that year. Her heart, the doctor said, though I knew it was the accumulated grief of 3 decades in bondage. She'd lost a husband and a daughter. She'd watched her surviving children navigate the impossible maze of plantation life. And finally, her body had simply refused to carry the weight any longer. Thomas recorded her death in his journals with clinical detachment. Female, age 51. House servant, died of heart failure, total years of service 31. Total offspring produced, 3, 1 sold, 1 deceased, 1 remaining. Economic value at death, minimal due to age and declining health. That was my mother's life, reduced to a notation in a ledger. I stood at her grave in the slave cemetery, not the clearing where Ruth was buried, but the official burial ground where deaths that could be acknowledged publicly were marked with wooden crosses, and made her a promise. I would survive this place. I would carry the testimony forward, and someday someone would know her name and history in a context that recognized her humanity rather than reducing her to economic calculations. After her death, I had no one left at Riverside who bound me through love. Mary was married and living on a neighboring plantation. The other slaves were friends and companions, but they weren't family in the way that creates obligations stronger than self-preservation. For the first time in my life, I was truly free to plan my own path forward, even while remaining legally enslaved. That's when I began to seriously consider what Augustus had told me years earlier. That I would outlive this place. And when I did, I would tell the story. I started thinking beyond survival to purpose, beyond endurance to testimony. The world was changing around us in ways that even the plantation owners couldn't completely control. Abolitionist literature was spreading despite laws against it. The Underground Railroad was growing more organized, tensions between North and South were escalating towards some future confrontation that everyone could sense, but no one could quite predict. And Thomas Hargrove's experiment in scientific slavery was beginning to look less like the future and more like a desperate attempt to justify an institution that was slowly revealing itself to be not just morally wrong, but economically and socially unsustainable. In 1842, everything began to accelerate toward its inevitable conclusion. A slave from a neighboring plantation, a man named Henry, who'd been hired out to work at Riverside during harvest season, escaped and made it all the way to Pennsylvania before being captured. His escape made headlines in the Richmond papers, both as a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving slaves too much independence and as a celebration of the Fugitive Slave Act's effectiveness. But Henry had kept a journal during his flight north. Portions of it were published in abolitionist newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston. In that journal, he described conditions on Virginia plantations based on stories heard from other slaves. He wrote about places where slaves disappeared without explanation, where owners kept detailed records of human endurance, where the machinery of bondage had been refined into something systematic and calculating. He never named Riverside specifically, but the details were close enough: the journals, the experiments, the documented erasers that several of Thomas's correspondents in his scientific slavery network sent urgent letters warning him to destroy any evidence that could be used against them if the political winds shifted. For the first time in my memory, I saw Thomas Hargrove truly afraid. He spent a week in his study, going through decades of journals and correspondence. He burned page after page in the fireplace, the smoke sometimes so thick that Richard had to open windows to keep the room breathable. They destroyed letters from other plantation owners, detailed observations about slave psychology and behavior, carefully documented accounts of erasers and their effectiveness as social controls. They were trying to erase the evidence of what they'd done, but they didn't realize how incomplete that erasure would be. I'd already memorized the most important information from those journals. I'd hidden certain key letters, the ones that most explicitly described the network of founders experimenting with systematic dehumanization in a space beneath a floorboard in the quarters. And several of the field hands had been keeping oral histories, passing stories from person to person, so that even if every physical record burned, the testimony would survive in memory. On August 17, 1842, Thomas called me to his study one final time. The room smelled of smoke and old paper. His hands shook as he gestured for me to sit, the first time in 33 years he'd ever offered me a chair in his presence. "Samuel," he said, his voice rough with and something that might have been shame. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. I'm dying," the doctor in Richmond confirmed it last month. "Something in my lungs, probably from all this smoke." He laughed bitterly. "Appropriate, I suppose. Killed by my own attempt to hide the evidence." That I waited, saying nothing. "I brought you here because you're the only person left who understands what I tried to do at Riverside. Augustus is gone. Richard thinks I was simply an efficient plantation manager. But you know the truth. You've read the journals. You've copied the letters. You know about the experiments, the documentation, the whole philosophical framework I built to justify it all. He pulled out a journal I hadn't seen before, newer than the others, with his cramped handwriting filling every page. This is my final confession. I suppose that I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you have no obligation to give it, but I need someone to understand what I learned after 33 years of trying to perfect the science of founding human beings. He pushed the journal across the desk toward me. The fundamental question I was trying to answer was this. How do you maintain an institution that you know in your deepest soul is morally indefensible? How do you own people when you've read Locke and Jefferson and understand that all men are created equal? How do you participate in systematic dehumanization when your own Christianity teaches that every soul has value? Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking impossibly old. The answer I found was that you make it a science. You convince yourself that you're not just exercising power arbitrarily, but gathering knowledge. You tell yourself that your observations have value, that someone someday will use your documentation to create a more humane system. You construct elaborate intellectual justifications for treating human beings as experimental subjects. You lied to yourself so thoroughly and so consistently that you almost believe it. And the people you killed? I asked, abandoning the pretense of deference that had protected me for so long. Ruth, Elijah, the 12 others in that clearing. What scientific purpose did they serve? Thomas met my eyes, and he saw something I'd never seen before: acknowledgement. They served the purpose of maintaining the lie. Every time someone threatened to expose the fundamental cruelty at the heart of what I was doing by escaping or questioning too loudly or simply existing as evidence of their own humanity, they had to be removed. Each erasure was documented, their circumstances recorded, their deaths analyzed for what they revealed about human psychology under extreme duress. But the real purpose was simpler. They died so I could continue pretending that what he was doing was science rather than slavery. He opened the journal and showed me pages filled with names and dates. Thesis: the complete record. Everyone who disappeared from Riverside over 33 years, 27 people, not 14. The clearing holds only the ones from the early years before I refined the methodology. The others were sold away to traders who specialized in making people vanish into the deeper south. Or they died in ways that could be attributed to accident or illness. But I knew. I always knew. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm dying, Samuel. And I need there to be a witness. Not to absolve me. Nothing can do that. But to confirm that I understood what I was doing, that I knew it was evil. And I did it anyway because the alternative, admitting that everything Virginia society was built on was a crime against humanity, was more terrifying than any individual act of cruelty. He closed the journal and pushed it toward me. This is yours now. Hide it. Burn it. Publish it when you're free. I don't care. But someone needs to know that I knew that we all knew. Every plantation owner who participated in his system understood on some level that we were committing crimes that would eventually be judged by history. That we just hoped we'd be dead before that judgment came. I picked up the journal, feeling its weight in my hands. I'll testify, I said quietly. But not for you, for them. For Ruth and Elijah and every person you documented and destroyed. That's the testimony the world needs. Not your confession, but their existence; not your guilt, but their humanity. Thomas nodded slowly, and for just a moment, I saw genuine understanding pass between us. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but mutual recognition of what we'd both been part of. Him as architect and me as witness. Then I suppose we understand each other one final time, he said. He died 8 months later in April of 1843. I was 34 years old and I had spent all but 9 years of my life in bondage to men who turned human beings into experiments and called it science. Just when you think you understand the full horror of what slavery contained, the depths prove to be even darker than imagined. If this testimony is affecting you, if you believe these stories need to be preserved and shared, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. The conclusion of Samuel's account will show how. Testimony survives even when everything else is destroyed. Let's continue. After Thomas's death in 1843, Richard inherited full control of Riverside along with all its debts, its declining productivity, and the weight off his father's legacy. He was 35 years old, married with 2 young children, and facing an economic reality that Thomas' scientific experiments had done nothing to solve. Virginia tobacco farming was becoming unsustainable. For 3 years, Richard tried to maintain the plantation in something approximating its former operation. But his heart wasn't in it the way Thomas had been. Richard had grown up watching his father's obsessive documentation, had seen the symposiums and the experiments, and somewhere along the way, he'd developed a kind of exhausted resignation about the whole enterprise of slavery. He wasn't kind. Kindness wasn't something plantation owners could afford economically or socially, but he wasn't actively cruel either. He simply managed us the way he managed the tobacco crops and the equipment as assets to be maintained at minimum cost until they could be sold or used up. I continued my work in the main house, managing records and correspondence. But now I also had Thomas's final journal hidden in the same space beneath the floorboards where I'd secreted the most incriminating letters years earlier. That journal was a complete confession. 27 names, dates, circumstances, and Thomas's own analysis of how he'd systematized murder and called it plantation management. It was testimony waiting for a world that might someday be ready to hear it. The mid-1840s were turbulent years across the South. The annexation of Texas brought new territory open to slavery's expansion, but it also intensified political debates between North and South. The question of whether slavery would spread or be contained was becoming the central crisis of American politics, and even enslaved people in remote Virginia plantations could sense that some fundamental confrontation was approaching. In the quarters, we spoke carefully about what we heard from the hired hands who came from other plantations, from the free black people who occasionally did business with Riverside, from the fragments of newspaper stories we could access. There was a world beyond the plantation boundaries where our status as human beings was being debated, contested, and slowly, far too slowly, recognized. In late 1846, several things happened almost simultaneously that would transform everything. First, Richard received notice that his largest creditors in Richmond were calling in their loans. The plantation's productivity had declined steadily over the previous decade, and the collateral had used, the land and property of Riverside, was no longer considered sufficient security. Second, Margaret became ill with the same kind of wasting disease that had killed Thomas's first wife, Catherine. The Richmond doctors were baffled. They prescribed treatments that accomplished nothing except draining Richard's remaining capital. And third, I made a decision that had been delaying for 4 years since Thomas' death. On November 12, 1846, I set fire to the main house at Riverside. It waited until I was certain Richard and his family were away from the building that I'd warned the house servants to be nowhere near the structure that night, telling them I'd heard strange sounds that might indicate structural problems, and then in the hour before dawn, I carried a lamp into Thomas's study, tipped it over onto the curtains, and walked away as the room filled with flames. The official story, which Richard told the insurance investigators and the county sheriff, was that a lamp had been accidentally knocked over during the night. Terrible tragedy, complete destruction of the main house, but thankfully, the family had been staying with Margaret's parents in Richmond during her illness. But I knew the truth. I destroyed Thomas Hargrove's legacy, burned every remaining journal, every piece of correspondence, every shred of his documentation project that hadn't already been hidden or memorized. What I couldn't destroy, what I'd carefully preserved, were the hidden letters and Thomas's final confession, those I'd wrapped in oilcloth and buried in 3 separate locations on the property, marked with stones that looked like any other river rock, but that I would recognize years later if I survived to retrieve them. The fire changed everything at Riverside. Richard didn't have the capital to rebuild the main house. His creditors, already nervous about the plantation's viability, refused to extend any additional credit. Margaret's medical expenses continued to mount, and the political climate was shifting in ways that made Virginia plantation ownership increasingly uncertain. By spring of 1847, Richard had made the decision that Thomas had resisted for 3 decades that he would sell Riverside piece by piece and move his family to Richmond, where he could establish himself in some kind-of commercial enterprise that didn't depend on the increasingly precarious economics of plantation slavery. The land was sold to a speculator who planned to subdivide it. The equipment was auctioned off, and yes, the slaves were sold, some in groups, some individually, scattered to other plantations across Virginia and the deeper South. I was sold to a Richmond merchant named Harrison Collins who needed a clerk for his dry goods business. He was a businessman with no interest in plantation management or experiments in human endurance. He simply wanted someone who could read, write, keep accounts organized, and manage his correspondence with suppliers. My Salito Collins was, in a sense, a promotion within the hierarchy of slavery. Working in a city environment, would have more autonomy, better conditions, and access to a wider world than I'd ever known at Riverside. But I was still enslaved, still property, still subject to being sold again if Collins's business failed or his needs changed. Before I left Riverside for the final time, I returned to the clearing beyond the cemetery. The 14 stones were still there, though many were now covered with vines and leaf litter. I stood among them and spoke the names I remembered, bearing witness one final time to the lives that Thomas Hargrove had attempted to erase. Ruth Pritchard, Elijah Turner, Thomas Freeman, Sarah Boyd, Daniel Matthews, Grace Taylor, Moses Wells, Isaac Henry, Benjamin Crawford, Esther Crawford, Rebecca Johnson, Joshua Parker, Solomon Hayes, Matthew Dixon, and one whose name was never recorded, buried there before me birth. 15 testimonies, not 14, I'd miscounted as a child. 15 people whose existence had been reduced to stones and memories. I promised them that I would survive to tell their stories. That someday when freedom came, if freedom came, I would return and speak their names in a world that recognized their humanity. Then I walked away from Riverside for what I thought would be the last time. Life in Richmond was a different kind of bondage. Collins treated me less like property and more like an employee he didn't have to pay, which was of course exactly what I was. I worked in his shop during the day managing inventory and customer accounts. At night, I was allowed to sleep in a small room above the store with access to Collins's personal library. For the first time in my life, I had hours of relative freedom. Collins didn't watch me constantly the way Thomas had. As long as the shop's accounts balanced and customers were satisfied, he left me largely alone. I used that freedom to educate myself further. I read everything I could access about the abolitionist movement, about the political debates over slavery's expansion, about the legal theories and constitutional arguments being made on both sides. I read Frederick Douglass's narrative when I found a hidden copy in a shipment of fused books. I read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin when it was published in 1852, recognizing in her fictional account many of the real horrors I'd witnessed, and I continued my mental documentation, now adding observations about urban slavery, about how the system functioned differently in cities than on plantations, about the ways enslaved people in Richmond created communities and networks that would have been impossible under the totalizing surveillance of plantation life. I met other enslaved and free black people who were part of underground networks. Not the famous Underground Railroad that helped people escape to the north, but settler networks that passed information, provided mutual aid, and maintained connections between scattered families. Through these networks, I learned that Augustus had died in Alabama in 1836, 8 years after being sold away from Riverside. But before his death, he taught literacy to 6 other slaves on the cotton plantation where he'd been sent. And those 6 had taught others. His testimony, like his teachings, had multiplied and spread in ways Thomas Hargrove could never have documented or controlled. I learned that my father, Jacob, had been sold twice more after leaving Riverside, ending up on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. He died there in 1841, 11 years after I'd last seen him. The records listed his cause of death as fever, but I knew that in Louisiana sugar country, fever was often what they called death by exhaustion. That I learned that my sister Mary and her husband Daniel had attempted to escape from the neighboring plantation where they'd been married. They'd been caught, and Daniel had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi as punishment. Mary had been kept in Virginia, but moved to a harsher situation as an example to other slaves. She died in 1849, the circumstances unclear in the fragmentary information I received. By 1850, I was 41 years old, and had been enslaved for 32 of those years, 28 at Riverside, 5 in Richmond. Everyone I'd been connected to by blood was dead, but I'd survived, and I'd maintained the testimony that Augustus had charged me to preserve. The 1850s were a decade of accelerating crisis. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to balance free and slave states, but only intensified the conflicts. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 led to violence in the territories. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 declared that black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. And through it all, I worked in Harrison Collins's shop, watched the political situation deteriorate, and waited for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859, the reaction in Richmond was panic and rage. White Virginians saw in Brown's attempt to spark a slave rebellion confirmation of their worst fears that the North wanted to destroy Southern society through violence. That abolitionists would arm slaves and encourage massacre. The reality was that most enslaved people weren't waiting for white abolitionists to save us. We were navigating our own paths to survival and, when possible, freedom. But Brown's raid accelerated the march toward war in ways that would eventually reshape everything. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president and 7 Southern states seceded before he even took office. Virginia initially resisted secession. But after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, the state voted to leave the Union in April 1861. Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy and the city transformed into a military center. Soldiers filled the streets, government offices took over buildings, and enslaved people like him found ourselves in a strange liminal space. Still legally property, but living in a city that was increasingly chaotic and under threat of invasion, Collins became a supplier for Confederate forces and his business initially thrived on military contracts, but as the war progressed and the Union blockade tightened, shortages became severe. By 1863, Richmond was under siege conditions, food was scarce, and Collins' business was failing. He became desperate and erratic, drinking heavily and making poor business decisions. In early 1865, as Union forces closed in on Richmond, he simply fled the city, joining the stream of Confederate officials and wealthy civilians who evacuated before the Federal occupation. He left everything behind, his shop, his inventory, his property, including me. For several days, I simply continued working in the shop, managing what little remained of the inventory, as if Collins would return at any moment. But the Confederate government was collapsing. Union troops were approaching. And the entire social order that had defined my life for 56 years was disintegrating around me. On April 3, 1865, Union forces entered Richmond. I stood in the doorway of Collins's shop and watched blue-coated soldiers march through streets filled with smoke from fires set by retreating Confederates. I watched enslaved people emerge from houses and workplaces. Some celebrating, some frightened, all uncertain about what came next. Freedom came not as a dramatic moment of liberation, but as a quiet realization that no one was coming to claim me anymore. The legal framework that had defined me as property had collapsed. I was for the first time in my life recognized by the government as a human being with agency and rights. I was 56 years old. I'd spent all but 9 years off me life in bondage. But I'd survived, and I'd maintained the testimony. What do you do with freedom when it finally arrives after decades of waiting? For some people, freedom meant moving immediately, going north, searching for family members sold away years earlier, starting completely new lives in places that had never known them as slaves. For me, freedom meant testimony. It meant returning to Riverside and retrieving what I had hidden. It meant speaking the names of the dead into whatever future might listen. In the summer of 1865, 3 months after the Confederate surrender, I made my way back to what had been Riverside Plantation. The journey took 3 days on foot. Richmond was still occupied by Union forces, and the countryside was devastated. Burned buildings, abandoned fields, former slaves, and former slave owners trying to figure out how to navigate a world turned upside down. The property that had been Riverside had changed hands twice during the war. The main house was still a burned-out ruin. No one had rebuilt it. The quarters where we'd lived were abandoned, though some of the structures still stood. The fields were overgrown, the tobacco barns collapsing that I went first to the clearing beyond the cemetery. The 15 stones were still there, though even more overgrown than before. I knelt beside each one and spoke the names again, this time as a free man bearing witness. Then I went to 3 locations where I'd buried Thomas's final confession and the most incriminating letters. 2 of Thekashakes were still there, the oilcloth intact, the documents readable despite 4 years underground. The third had been disturbed, probably by an animal or by erosion, and the papers inside were too damaged to salvage. Booty had enough. I had Thomas's confession that I had letters from plantation owners discussing their experiments in systematic dehumanization that I had my own testimony carried in memory for decades. I brought everything to the Freedmen's Bureau in Richmond, the federal agency established to help former slaves navigate their new freedom. I told my story to a young officer from Massachusetts named Lieutenant James Whitfield, no relation to the North Carolina planter who'd corresponded with Thomas years earlier. Whitfield listened to my account with growing amazement. He examined the documents, made careful notes, asked detailed questions. He was particularly interested in the network of plantation owners who'd been experimenting with what Thomas had called scientific slavery. "This is evidence of conspiracy," Whitfield said, looking through the letters. "Multiple owners coordinating their methods, sharing information, essentially creating a systematic approach to human rights violations. Can they be prosecuted?" I asked. Whitfield hesitated. "It's complicated. Many of them are dead. Others are protected by amnesty agreements. And frankly, the legal system is overwhelmed with more immediate concerns. Reuniting families, establishing labor contracts, dealing with violence against freed people." He saw my expression and added quickly. "But this needs to be preserved. This is historical evidence that shouldn't be lost. I'll make sure it's included in the Bureau's records, and you should give testimony formally, create a written account that can be preserved." Over the next several weeks, I worked with Whitfield to create a formal written testimony. I told him everything. The 37 years of my captivity, Thomas's experiments, the disappearances, Augustus's counterledger, the symposiums where plantation owners compared methodologies, the network of men who tried to make slavery into a science. Whitfield recorded it all in careful handwriting, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or to verify details against the documents I'd provided. When we were finished, the testimony was 43 pages long, the longest single account in the Richmond Freedmen's Bureau files. "What happens to this now?" I asked. "It gets filed with all the other testimonies we're gathering," Whitfield said. "Thousands of accounts from across the South about what slavery was really like. Someday historians will use these records to understand this period. Your testimony will be part of that understanding." It wasn't justice. Exactly. The men who'd participated in Thomas's network were mostly dead or beyond reach of prosecution. The legal system that was slowly being reformed to recognize black testimony wasn't equipped to prosecute crimes committed when that testimony would have been inadmissible, but it was something. It was truth entering the official record. Impossible to erase or deny. In 1872, 7 years after emancipation, I learned that one of the letters I'd preserved, a particularly detailed one from Matthias Cutler in South Carolina describing his graduated pressure system and erasure responses, had made its way to a congressional committee investigating post-war violence and exploitation in the South. A representative from Massachusetts, a man named George, read portions of the letter into the official congressional record during a debate about federal enforcement of civil rights. Protections for freed people. He used it as evidence that slavery hadn't been merely a labor system, but a comprehensive program of dehumanization that its practitioners had consciously designed and refined. Thomas Hargrove's philosophy, his careful justifications for turning human suffering into data, became part of the documented history of slavery's intellectual foundations. It still wasn't justice, but it was testimony that couldn't be burned or buried. I lived in Richmond for the rest of my life, working first for the Freedmen's Bureau and later as a teacher in one of the schools established for formerly enslaved people. I taught literacy and mathematics, but I also taught history. The history of what we'd survived. The history that official accounts tried to soften or ignore. Married in 1868, a woman named Sarah who'd been enslaved on a plantation in North Carolina and had walked to Richmond after emancipation searching for a sister sold away during the war. We never found her sister, but we built a life together, and we had 3 children who grew up free in ways we'd never imagined possible. I never forgot Riverside. I never forgot the names of the people buried in that clearing, and I never stopped testifying about what I'd witnessed during my 37 years of captivity. In 1879, I was invited to speak at a convention of former slaves in Washington, D.C. Nearly 500 people attended, men and women who'd survived bondage and were now building lives in freedom, but who understood that our testimonies needed to be preserved before we died and our stories died with us. I told them about Thomas Harrove and his experiments. I told them about Augustus and his counterledger. It told them about the network of plantation owners who tried to make slavery scientific and humane while committing atrocities they carefully documented in private journals. And it told them why testimony mattered not just for history but for the future, because the children growing up free needed to understand what freedom had cost. Because the white people who wanted to pretend slavery had been a benign institution needed to confront the documented evidence of what it actually was. Because truth had a value that transcended immediate justice or personal vindication. After my talk, an older woman approached me. She was perhaps 70 with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I was at a plantation in South Carolina," she said quietly. "The owner there kept journals like the man you described. He called it his management archive. After the war, I went back and tried to find those journals, but they'd been burned. The evidence was lost." "It's not lost if you remember it," I told her. "Our memories are testimony. Our survival is testimony. They tried to reduce us to numbers in their ledgers, but we're still here speaking our own truths." She nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I should start writing it down." "Yes," I said, "write it all down because testimony survives. I'm 75 years old now, writing this in 1884. I've outlived all the Harroves I knew, Thomas Richard, even young Richard Jr. who died last year in Richmond. I've outlived most of the people I was enslaved with, though I've maintained contact with the few survivors and tried to document their stories alongside mine. The clearing at Riverside is completely overgrown now. The property has been subdivided and sold multiple times. Modern houses stand where the tobacco fields used to be. No historical marker indicates what happened there. No monument acknowledges the 15 people buried beyond the cemetery. But I know theory there. And I've made sure their names are recorded in multiple locations in the Freedmen's Bureau files and my written testimony in the oral histories I've shared with my children and students in this account I'm writing now. Testimony survives. That's what Augustus taught me. That's what I've tried to pass forward. The world is different now than it was during my childhood in bondage. Black people vote, hold office, own property, educate our children. The changes are fragile, and there are people working to undo them, but they're real. The legal framework that defined human beings as property has been destroyed. But the psychological and social frameworks, the beliefs about racial hierarchies, the justifications for inequality, the tendency to reduce human beings to economic or political abstractions, those survive in more subtle forms. That's why testimony matters. That's why the truth about what slavery actually was, not what people want to remember it being, has to be preserved and repeated. This is my testimony about what I witnessed during 37 years of captivity at Riverside Plantation in Virginia. It's the testimony of Ruth Pritchard, who asked too many questions and was buried in an unmarked grave. It's the testimony of Augustus, who created a counter-ledger and was sold away for his trouble. It's the testimony of Elijah Turner, Isaiah, and 13 others whose names might otherwise be forgotten. It's testimony about how human cruelty can be systematized, documented, and justified by intelligent people who convince themselves they're acting scientifically rather than simply exercising power. And it's testimony about how truth survives in memory, in hidden documents, in stories passed from person to person, in the simple fact of survival itself. What do you think of this account? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or are there questions that should still be asked about how slavery was practiced and justified? Leave your comment below with your thoughts about Samuel's testimony and what it reveals about the story's hidden crimes. If you want more stories that have been buried or forgotten, histories that challenge comfortable narratives and force us to confront uncomfortable truths, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. These stories must be told even when they're difficult to hear, especially when they're difficult to hear. Share this video with someone who believes that understanding history, no matter how painful, is essential to building a better future. Leave a comment sharing where you're from and what this testimony means to you. This is Samuel Pritchard's testimony given in his own words about 37 years of captivity and what he witnessed during that time. May it serve as one small piece of the great ledger that history is still compiling. A ledger that recognizes the humanity of those who suffered, the crimes of those who profited, and the importance of testimony that refuses to be silenced.